We're in an era when we are surrounded by so-called experts. And whether it's through a book, a blog, a podcast, they want to share with us the techniques, the strategies to get what it is you're looking for. So whether it's moving forward, success, whether it's in every category. So whether it's church leadership, business, relationships, money, health, whatever it is, they want to share with you the shortcuts to success. And the challenge with this is, what happens is if we're not careful, we can find ourselves grasping, going in circles, trying so many different things to find the thing that will propel us forward. And worse, we can wind up distracted and even lose momentum by pursuing all of these. So what I want to share with you today is a very simple way to evaluate whether you should implement something. Now, first, before we go there, I want to share with you an absolute foundational principle. There are no shortcuts. There aren't any. There are no shortcuts, but there are accelerators. Now, I'm sure using the messaging, I'm going to get people say, well, Randy, what about? No, there are no shortcuts. The Bible is clear about that. And I'm not going to take the time to delve into that. But what does God honor? God honors faithfulness. And shortcuts and faithfulness don't mix. They're oil and water. There are no shortcuts, but there are accelerators. So I'm going to show you how to break this down. And it's very simple. Whatever advice you're getting, whatever technique, whatever strategy, it's very simple. We just break it into one of two categories. It's that simple. It's either a principle or it's a practice. Okay? Now, so we're going to look at principles first. A principle is something that lines up with God's Word. And if it lines up with God's Word, it will, first off, it will always work. It will work in any culture. It will work in any situation. Now, principles also a couple of things to understand. First off, sometimes they're counterintuitive. I know in business in the past, we've used biblical principles that were completely not only counterintuitive, but worldly people say, oh, that will never work. And God gave us great success because God will always honor His Word. So first off, they can be counterintuitive. Number two, the challenges with principles so often is we don't necessarily see what's happening. It's like planting a seed. There's an aspect of faith that goes with applying principles. And number three, principles need us to continually use them. See, what happens? You might apply a principle, but then if you don't see much happening, and that's the challenge with all this advice. You're moving on to the next thing before you gave that a chance to work. A principle that is continually reinforced over time is not only effective, but will grow exponentially. Okay? Now, everything else is a practice. And practices aren't necessarily bad, but anything that doesn't line up with God's Word is just a practice. And there are times when practices can work. But one of the things we need to do with practices first, recognize they don't always work. They're not universal. We can't apply it to every church, every business, every culture, every relationship, every situation. We need to evaluate. So principles as a group will always work. Practices have to be examined on an individual basis. We have to look at that one technique, that one strategy individually. And if it doesn't line up with God's Word, first off, does it violate God's Word? Okay. Does it go against God's Word? And if so, well, obviously we know don't waste our time with it. God won't honor that in the long term. But let's suppose a practice is neutral. Then before we get all excited and go run and say, I don't know about you, I do that. You get excited about something and how it might work in your life, in your church, in your whatever. And there's this desire to implement it, get it working right away. But one of the things I've had to learn is to slow down, chew on that. Okay, It doesn't violate God's word, so it's neutral, but is God instructing me? Do I feel that sense that God is saying, yeah, use this tool in this situation. Use this strategy in this relationship, in this, whatever the case may be. We need to have, if we're going to implement a practice, we need to just not try it, but we need to have a conviction that God is behind this and He wants to use this in whatever it is. Again, in your church, your business, your finances, whatever it may be. The most powerful things are always principles. And I'll give you an example of practices, and this is not necessarily a great example, but how many times have you seen where somebody has a successful church? And the next thing you know, you see people changing the names of their church to match that one. Like there was some kind of magic in the name. Or someone has some success in business, in church, whatever, and they write a book on how they had their success. And then people go and immediately try to copy and implement it. Now, one of the things we need to recognize, and here's where principles work and practices don't always. God is big and amazing. Okay? He created the entire universe. But God is creative. And I'm a firm believer in God never does the same things twice. So while His principles always work because He will always honor His word, with practices, that's why we need that conviction that God is saying, yes, use this practice, implement this in your business, your ministry, whatever the case may be, and I'm going to honor it. But if we're doing it just because it worked for someone else, remember, God is big and creative, and He never does it the same way twice. Let's start evaluating. Let's move forward by applying God's principles on a consistent basis. Watch His power work. Watch us have God-powered success.